The Fed's attempt to curb inflation by raising interest rates has sparked concerns among some that the move could send the U.S. economy into a recession, with troubling signs in the housing market sending up red flags first. According to Politico, mortgage rates nearly doubled in the first half of the year, and new home sales last month were down 30% from the previous year.
With home purchases down and mortgage demand at a 22-year low, real estate investor Graham Stevens says a storm is brewing in the housing market. Economics professor and co-founder of Democracy at Work, Richard Wolff, joins us now to weigh in. Thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.
So how dire is the situation? What are the indicators you're looking at when you're evaluating what's going on?
Well, it is well known in economics that the housing market is a crucial part of our economy, not just for the question of how many houses or homes or apartments are changing hands, but because when housing is built, then there's orders for furniture and appliances, and so it has a ramifying effect. Any drop of significant size in a short amount of time, which is exactly what we have now, is a clear sign that we're heading into a recession. Not that we lack for signs, there are plenty more of them, but we are now in the unspeakable, difficult situation of having put our working people through a pandemic that wasn't well handled, to be kind, through a crash in 2020 and 21, second only to the Great Depression, then an inflation still going on, and now we're going to give them the unemployment, or to quote the Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, the pain in our society of unemployment coupled to rising interest rates. This is a level of whacking the mass of our people that goes a long way to explaining the kinds of political and other splits and hostilities that are all around us.
So, Professor Wolff, I take it that you don't agree with the Fed's plan to kind of force unemployment to try to curb the crisis. To what do you attribute the root? What is at the root of causing the inflation crisis, and what would you do? What would you recommend to try to address it in the alternative?
Let me go in reverse order to your questions, which are, spot on. The remarkable thing about what the Fed is doing is behaving and talking with complete complicity of both the Democratic and Republican leaderships, talking as if raising interest rates is the only way to deal with an inflation. First of all, there ought to be some humility. The Federal Reserve was created in the United States over a century ago with the number one task of what's called maintaining price stability. An inflation is the opposite of that. So the Federal Reserve didn't do its job real well. It waited too long, it did too little, and here we are with 8 or 9% inflation. But raising interest rates never was, and is not now, the only way to go. Why are we not having a debate? For example, in 1971 August, with a conservative Richard Nixon as president, we had an inflation, and the president acted. He declared a wage price freeze. Overnight, the inflation stopped because it became illegal for any business to raise their prices or for any workers to raise their wages. I'm not arguing we should do it or we shouldn't. Every policy response has its problems. But we're in a very strange country that pretends that there aren't options. Roosevelt in the 1940s put the market aside altogether to stop an inflation and substituted government rationing. We all got ration books and we tore out stamps in order to buy gasoline, milk, meat, sugar, coffee, and a whole host of other things. That's another way to stop or prevent an inflation. We're not having a debate. We're acting as though raising interest rates is the only way to go. And of course, that hurts the poorest people the most because they can't afford higher interest rates, or at least not as well as people that are richer. So this is a peculiar choice that whacks the mass of people. And as I just finished trying to explain, that's a very weird choice after the inflation has hurt them so much, and the crash and the pandemic. It's remarkable that you don't go after those who are most able to pay extra taxes, to deal with a wage price freeze, for example, as a way to go. You could freeze the prices, let the wages go up, and that would get you 2 for 1. You'd stop the inflation, prices can't go up, and you do something about the inequality by allowing the wages to go up at some limited rate while the prices can't. And so you'd get less inequality and a stopped inflation. That we don't even discuss this when a Republican president did it not all that long ago is a remarkable thing. Now, as to why the inflation we have is a problem in the first place, well, let's all remember something that economics teaches and that a lot of folks seem to forget. Only a very small number of people in our society are in the position of deciding what the price of anything is. Those people are called employers. Employees don't make that decision. Employers do. Goods, services, doesn't matter. It's the employer who decides whether to keep the price what it was, raise it, or lower it. And so if you have an inflation, it means that employers, less than 1% of the American people, are in fact deciding to raise prices. And the rest of us, the other 99%, we're required to pay them. Now, this is remarkable because when you ask employers, well, why did you do this thing, which hurts so many of us, they have an awkward moment. The honest answer would be, we did that for the same reason we do everything, to make more profit. That's what we're in business to do. That doesn't play well with people. So they have to come up with other arguments. Supply chain disruptions, China, Ukraine. I mean, grasping around for anything that will justify what they did. And worst of all, many of the media treatments of this don't go to the question, why did the employers do it? They jump nicely over it and start taking seriously the excuses that are given, sometimes true, often not, as if that were the necessary way to answer the question.
But I mean, Professor, the businesses are always profit-seeking, right? Their motivations haven't changed substantially. They're profit-seeking during periods of economic hardship, and they're profit-seeking during periods of economic boon. So we ourselves have pointed to, so correct us if you have a different view of it, the Ukraine war and the disruption to the supply chains as things that you could single out as what's different about right now. Well, what's different about right now? One thing is the U.S. is arming a Ukrainian resistance to continue a conflict with Russia that has had massive ramifications on the supply of food, the supply of energy, and other things. So are you saying that's kind of being falsely painted as a major contributor to our current situation?
Yeah, I think it plays some role. There's no problem bringing it in. Every particular experience of inflation has its particular causes right then and there that are unique to that moment in history. But it's the more basic one that ought to be part of the conversation that isn't, which is we let decisions about prices, which affect all of us, be decided by a single tiny minority of our people whose focus is not on the impact to all of us, but on the bottom line of their businesses. If I were to give a long list, I would add to those you mentioned the fundamental profit drive, which is governing, and then to remember that over the last 2 years, 2020 and 2021 particularly, many businesses had a terrible hard time. They didn't make the profits that they had hoped to. They didn't make the economic growth that they had hoped to and invested in and borrowed on the basis of. So they had some catching to do starting in the latter half of 2021. And they did it in the easiest, quickest way to recoup profits in a short amount of time by jacking up their prices big time in a hurry. And to leave all that out, again, has this peculiar quality of not talking about who's actually doing the inflating of prices, and what are the complex reasons, and do we really as a society want to let that way of making so basic a decision as the price level we live with for all of us to absorb when we have no say in making that decision?
Professor Wolff, maybe help us understand what's going on specifically with the housing market in particular. You know, millennials as a generational cohort have been hurt, I think, the worst among all generational cohorts, and are really looking down the barrel of even worse outcomes. And people are curious about what is causing home prices to be so high, mortgage rates to be so high, why it is that there's this lack of builder confidence. Does it have nothing to do with these supply chain issues where there has been a conversation about construction materials and things like that not being as accessible? Is it related to this broader issue we've been talking about for some time about there being a housing deficit in the country, generally speaking? Is it because millennials tend to be suffering under the burden of student debt payments that are going to get some relief because of Biden's recent policy, but still trouble the bulk of our generational cohort? You know, what do you attribute the particularized issues with housing costs?
Well, we have a number of factors that come together. There's no particular magic bullet that explains it all. There rarely is, and there isn't in this case. Let's go through a couple of them that are important. You picked one, absolutely true. We have a new generation of people who are coming through college educated, therefore likely to get a reasonably better job than if you're not college educated, but now carrying levels of debt that in a way undo what college educations used to mean. You would get a good job, but you wouldn't be saddled with debt. So now we have a generation that has a whole new set of problems because of the debt, and Mr. Biden's relief of that debt is too late and too modest to make much difference there. And one of the first basic expenses people can go without is getting their own a place to be. A record statistic these days is the proportion of millennials and others who are living with their parents, living in a home that isn't theirs for long, years and years at a time, in a way we haven't seen for a very long time in our culture's history. Then we also have, the profit motive. Builders of homes are going where the profit is. If you remember that for the last 30 years, the gap between rich and poor in this country have gotten much larger, well, the profit is in building luxury housing. The profit is in building housing where the market is flush and can afford it, not in the vast majority of Americans who are having a hard time coping with the range of expenses they have. And if you put on top of that an inflation, well, you know, you're overloading the situation to make the kind of crisis that we have. If you had a public housing program, as for example, virtually every country in Europe does, then you would have the government stepping in moments like this in order to smooth out the crazy housing market, which goes way up and then way down in the way that we're experiencing. If I could say a last word about these supply chain shocks or disruptions. Every significant corporation in America has a department called the purchasing department, and there's a purchasing manager. And the job of the purchasing department, and this has been true for a century, is to deal with, get ready, disruptions in the supply chain. That's their job. If you can't get lumber and you're a chair maker, if you can't get lumber from where you used to get it, you're supposed to have in place a plan B and a plan C, an alternative supplier, an alternative supply route. That's your job. You can't come to the CEO and say, there's been disruptions. And the CEO will look at you with a funny look and explain to you, you're the purchasing manager. That's what you're there for. We pay you the big bucks so that you arrange for and have good relationships with the ways to get around these disruptions, which are normal in most business situations and are not peculiar now, and certainly not in the level of explanatory power that folks want to give to them.
Well, Professor, thank you so much for shedding some light on this situation. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Glad to speak with you.
And we'll be back with more Rising right after this.